This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Although some commentaries say that Kinnah Chafei is the first Kinnah recited on Tisha B'Av that speaks about tragedy unrelated to the Churban, Rav Soloveitchik argues that in fact it's Kinnah Chav Beis. That's the first one commemorating the massacres of the communities of the Rhineland, Spires, Mainz, and Worms during the First Crusade in 1096. Accordingly, there is a line in the Kinnah which would be understood in the context of the Crusades. On page 258, when talking about the massacre of these communities, we say, Mi yafli nazirois umiyaroich nidarim. Who will now interpret the intricacies of the Nazirite vows? Who will now arrange the complex laws of oaths and annulment? It refers to Nazirus and Nidarim, which at first glance do not seem like the most pressing topics. You know, most people, when they have a shaila, they don't say, I wish I had an expert in the laws of Nazirus. Most people don't take upon themselves being a Nazirite. However, Rav Soloveitchik explains that in the context of the tragedy of the Crusades, the meaning of this line comes to light. The intent of the Paitan is to allude to two Mesechtos in Shas that we don't have Perush Rashi. We all know that without Rashi HaKadosh, the Shas is a Sefer Chosam. And yet there are two Mesechtos that Ad Hayom Hazeh remain very difficult. Mesechta Nazarim, Mesechta Nazirus, Mesechta Nazir. And there could have been another Rishon from the base Rashi who would have stood up, maybe Rashbam, maybe the Ri Hazaken, and they could have wrote a Perush on Nadarim and Nazir. But all the German Balei HaTosfos were murdered, they were killed out. There was no one to write these commentaries. And therefore, Ad Hayom, when we learn these Masechtas, it's not the same. We cannot get to the same level of understanding as the other Masechtas because we don't have Rashi, and we don't have anyone who is able to be Memale Makom Rashi. Now let me share with you a personal question that I've been grappling with over the last couple of days regarding the tragedy of the Crusades. According to Rav Moshe, the Kinnus of Tisha B'Av is reserved only for tragedy directly related to Churban. So therefore, we can mourn the Holocaust. That was from the presiding government, the Germans, world power. But we're not going to talk about the Chmielnicki pogroms because that's unrelated to the Holocaust. Because that wasn't perpetrated by the government, it was anti-government. And studying the Crusades over the last couple of months, it's somewhat difficult for me to understand why the tragedies of the Crusades are included in the liturgy of Tisha B'Av. Were the Crusades perpetrated by the government? When Pope Urban called for the Crusades, 100,000 people answered the call. And the purpose of the Crusades was to liberate Jerusalem from the Muslim infidels. They weren't charged with wiping out Jewish communities. They weren't supposed to massacre Mainz and Spires and Worms. In the First Crusade, they didn't do anything to French Jewry, and they weren't supposed to do anything to German Jewry. That happened through the People's Crusade. The crusade of Peter the Hermit. He must have been a very friendly gentleman, Peter the Hermit. But he was a soothsayer and a magician, and they would take a goose and they would set the goose off, and then 10,000 people would run after the goose. And if the goose ran to Spires, they went to Spires, and if it went to Jerusalem, they went to Jerusalem. We're talking about there were tens of thousands of knights roaming Europe. What was the job of a knight? The job of a knight was to fight a war. So the government didn't know what to do with these knights. A knight in a feudal society, a knight has to pillage, kill, and rape. That's his job description. He didn't know how to lend money. He didn't know how to change plumbing. He couldn't sell used cars. He was a knight. So Pope Urban had to come up with the idea of the crusade to give these chaleria something to do. So they were unguided, and some of them went off, and they destroyed mains, spires. I mean, was this, according to Rav Moshe's definition, that on Tisha B'Av we only mourn tragedy a result of the presiding government? Were the Crusades really the devastation wrought by the government, or were these a bunch of rebels? The same way we don't mourn Chmielnicki, why are we talking about the Crusades on Tisha B'Av? Maybe you could say, well, they were under the auspices. Maybe Rav Moshe would say they were under the auspices of the Holy Roman Empire. But the Roman Empire didn't even want the crusade. They didn't know what to do with them, because after they destroyed the Jewish communities, they went after the Roman Empire. They went after the governors. They went after the clergy. I would humbly suggest, continuing the theme that we suggested for the Asara Harugei Malchus, that the purpose of saying the Kinnus is not to commemorate Jewish tragedy. Jewish people do not commemorate Jewish tragedy. We have better things to do with our time than to commemorate tragedy. What's the purpose of commemorating tragedy? Never forget. Why not? There has to be a tachlis. There's a purpose. It's always to identify the cause of Jewish tragedy and to rectify it. And that's how we don't talk about the Chmielnicki pogroms, because the root cause of the Chmielnicki pogroms is not relevant to Tisha B'Av. But the root cause of the Crusades are very relevant to Tisha B'Av. The Sefer Seder Hadoros of Rabbi Chil Halpern, who the Chida called a great Chacham and a great historian, he writes in his entry for the year 1620 that the Sma writes that the reason why the German Kehilos, especially Worms, suffered greater fate than any other community is because when Ezra returned to rebuild the second temple, the same way the Levium didn't want to return, there were communities already established in Germany, and they didn't want to return. And they said, you go up to your big Jerusalem there in Israel, and we'll stay in our little Jerusalem here in Varmaiza. And the Sma said, because they didn't take up the opportunity to go to Eretz Yisrael, and they had the opportunity, they were massacred and wiped out and destroyed. And isn't that not a relevant root cause connected to the Churban Beis HaMikdash? Because the chait that brought about Churban, of course, was the chait of the Meraglim. And our me'isa toward Eretz Yisrael, our disgust with Eretz Yisrael. And that was repeated again in the time of the Crusades. And accordingly, this year at Tavshin Pei Beis, we've come up with a really new and revolutionary approach to a thematic approach to all the Kinnus. None of the Kinnus are just to commemorate Jewish tragedy. The purpose of the Kinnus is to identify the causes of Churban that have continued throughout the generations. Be it Sinas Chinam of the Asara Harugei Malchus. Be it the lack of love toward Eretz Yisrael that we see exhibited in the piyutim about the Crusades. And therefore, we are not mourning these disasters just to mourn Jewish tragedy, but to identify the cause. You know, the Baal Nesivos HaMishpat writes in his commentary to Eicha, V'dimasaha alecheya. The tear is still on the cheek. Says in the Nesivos, the tear of the Meraglim, when they cried, we're not interested in the Holy Land, that tear is still on our cheek. We're still not interested. We prefer our invented Yerushalayim, our mythical Yerushalayim here in the Galus, and we still are not answering the call of Ezra. And whether it's our choice of lifestyle, location, yeah, I know the yeshivas, we don't have the education systems, but what about when we retire? Is Florida also Yerushalayim? Is Miami Beach also Yerushalayim? Is every community that we go to, that's our Yerushalayim? But the theme of the Kinnah is to identify V'dimasa alecheya, the tear of the Meraglim. We're still crying that same tear. Kinnah Chaf Beis. It's very difficult to understand why we interrupt the regular flow of the Kinnus that talk about national disaster, enormous death toll, to tell one isolated tale of one boy and one girl. As recounted in the Gemara in Gittin Daf Nun Ches, the son of Rabbi Shmuel Kohen Gadol was exceptionally handsome. In fact, on Yom Kippur we relate that he was so handsome the daughter of the emperor wanted to flay his skin so that she could gaze at it. And the daughter of Rabbi Shmuel Kohen Gadol, who was strikingly beautiful, they were both sold as slaves. This was after the death of Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. After the death of Rabbi Shmuel Kohen Gadol. So they were Yesoimim, one boy and one girl, in the context of millions of people. Is it really appropriate to segue and to break the flow and to talk about one isolated story? Look on the page 260, the bottom of the page. So you had these two masters. They both said, I have a beautiful slave woman, and the other one said, I have a very handsome slave. And they said, okay, if we mate them together, we'll be able to produce the most exquisite slaves. So they stood outside the room, and inside the room, they each cried bitterly, with soul and fear. Ad boiker bechisam loy hadmima, their cries did not still until the morning. Ze yispaid bechel uvekarav lev yimsa. He mourned, a tremble inside his heart was melting. Listen carefully. This was a very tempting opportunity for the son of Rabbi Shmuel Kohen Gadol. His father was dead. He had no family. Nobody was watching. How did he withstand this nisayon? Did he say, how could he do this avera? He's going to be punished. He's going to burn in the purgatory. Listen to what stopped him. Nin aharoin eich l'shivcha yehei noisei. I'm a scion of Aaron. I'm of royal bearing, royal lineage. I can't let down the aristocracy of my lineage. Similar to when Yosef HaTzadik saw Demus the Yuknoi Shal Aviv. As Rabbeinu Yoina says, the greatest safeguard not to sin is not schar v'oinesh. It's gadlus ha'adam. It's recognizing how valuable you and your ancestors are to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Kinnah continues, Or boiker zeh kehakira, in the morning when they recognized each other. Haya achi v'haya achos higbirai, whoa brother, whoa sister, they intensified their cries. V'nizdabku yachad v'nischabru, they embraced each other and they cleaved. Ad yatzasa nishmasam b'neshima, until their souls left. Lezois yikainen Yirmiyah b'shir, for this Yirmiyah lamented. And at first glance, the placement of this kinnah seems incongruous. Here we're talking about the mass murder of hundreds of thousands of Jews, and now we're going to speak about the isolated situation of one boy and one girl. Why interrupt the story for the death of two individuals? And Rav Soloveitchik suggests that is because Judaism has a different approach to the individual. We mourn every individual even if they're not a leader, they're not a scholar, and they didn't play a major role. Their parents had been killed in light of major catastrophes. Who is responsible to remember the story of the nameless, faceless individual who were taken captive? And the answer is, we are responsible. We have a special kinnah dedicated just for them, as if they would be 100,000 people. Their life has to be memorialized. We don't forget any yachid in our people. Even when telling the story of the greatest disasters, the individual is never overshadowed. But there's an additional pedagogical reason to mention this story. You know, the Medrash says in Parshas Noach that Rabbi Akiva was once fundraising. And he went to the city of Ginzik and he wanted to inspire the people. So he said, you have to give tzedakah. Do you know what could happen? God killed in the Mabul millions of people. Then they're looking at Rabbi Akiva and they're scrolling on their phone. Nah, nothing. Rabbi Akiva made no impact on them. And then Rabbi Akiva told the story of Eiv, and they broke down crying. It is easier to move a person with an incident of an individual rather than telling the story about the death of thousands. A human being has a hard time connecting. The death of thousands cannot resonate with the limited, finite human mind. It's the story of the individual that has more meaning for the human heart. And I want to conclude, my dear friend Reb Shlomo Margarefta was ma'ir me many years ago that the story of the son and daughter of Rabbi Shmuel Kohen Gadol was a tikkun for the episode of Amnon and Tamar. They somehow were the tikkun for the story of Amnon and Tamar. Kina Chaf Gimel. That's Navi Chatasi Hishmima. Kina Lamed Vav. Tzion Haloi Sishali. This kina begins the last group of the Kinnus, 10 piyutim that are known as the Tzion Kinnus. All of these 10 Kinnus, with the exception of one, begin with the word Tzion, and they are concerned with the fact that Eretz Yisrael is the chosen land of God. Studying these Kinnus, one may wonder, these do not seem to be Kinnus at all. We're not mourning anything, they're not mournful, they're not sorrowful. They're hopeful, they're longing, they speak about the great love of Eretz Yisrael. Why are they classified as Kinnus? Why do they even belong here? But as mentioned, the purpose of the Kinnus is not to commemorate Jewish tragedy. We have better things to do with our time than to commemorate Jewish tragedy. The purpose of the Kinnus is to identify the root cause of the disasters and the atrocities and how we could correct it. And the primary root cause of all Jewish suffering is apathy and disgust with Eretz Yisrael. It began with the Chet HaMeraglim, V'dimasa Alecheya, and it continues until today. And therefore, the grand finale of the Kinnus is Tzion Haloi Sishali L'Shloim Asirayach, written by Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, one of the greatest of the all-time Paitanim. In fact, the Rashba on Shuvah Taf Yud Ches writes Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is the greatest in merit and distinction of all the Paitanim. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi was one of the Rishonim, born in Toledo in 1080. He was the Talmud of the Rif and the Ri Magash, who they recently found his kever, and you know what that means. Aside from the studying, by the way, I was at the kever of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, even though nobody knows where he's buried, but the best account they have is that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is buried in an Arab village in the north of Israel, in the city of Kabul, and he's buried next to the Ibn Ezra and Rabbi Shlomo Ibn Gabriel, and we got police protection with cooperation from the Palestinian police protection. And if you want to see how that worked, there's something called TorahAnytime.com. You could see the Israeli police and the Palestinian police escorting us to the kever of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi was literally in love with the land of Israel. He's the one who uttered the famous words, Libi ba'mizrach va'ani b'soif marav. And there have been many pilgrims who traveled to Eretz Yisrael no one expressed their love for Eretz Yisrael like Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. The Rambam in the Moreh Nevuchim only mentions Eretz Yisrael one time. Rabbeinu Bechaye does not mention Eretz Yisrael at all in the entire Chovos HaVavos. Even the Ramban, who is a great lover of the land of Israel, only mentions Eretz Yisrael in a halachic sense. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, however, expressed his passion in a very poetic, literary style. On page 328, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is Mekoinein. Miyaseli kinafayim v'archik nedoid. Who shall make me wings so that I might wander far away? Onid lebisrei levavi. I would cause my shattered heart to wander bein b'seiroyich, amidst your shattered ruins. What does Rabbi Yehuda Halevi mean? Can I be a bird and fly? Did Rabbi Yehuda Halevi literally want to grow wings? I believe he's echoing the words of the greatest lover of Eretz Yisrael, Moshe Rabbeinu. The Medrash tells us in Dvarim Rabbah that when Hashem told Moshe Rabbeinu, look from the mountain, you could see it, but you can't go there. So Moshe said, if I can't go there, let me go like an animal. So Hashem said, you can't go like an animal. So Moshe said, let me at least fly through the land like a bird. Hashem said, Rav Lach, too much. You can't even fly through a bird, like a bird. So Moshe asks in the Daras Moshe that the Gemara in Soita says that Moshe wanted to enter Eretz Yisrael to mekayim mitzvos hatluyos ba'aretz. But if he would go in as a bird, he can't fulfill the mitzvah. So of what benefit would it be to fly through the land of Israel like a bird? Says Rav Moshe, from here we see the great spiritual benefit of merely passing through the airspace of Eretz Yisrael, even without fulfilling any mitzvahs. What is the holiness of Eretz Yisrael? You ready for this? What imbues Kedusha into Eretz Yisrael? Is it the Beis HaMikdash? Certainly. Is it the Koisel HaMaravi? Yes. But listen to the words of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. Apel la'apei alei artzech. I would fall with my face on your soil. Ve'artza avonech l'ma'od. I would intensely cherish your stones. Va'achoynei nasafeiroich. And I would favor your dust. Even the stones, even the dirt of Eretz Yisrael are endowed with desirable qualities. Like the Gemara says in Ksubis that Rabbi Abba would literally kiss the stones of Akai. In this week's parsha, Moshe Rabbeinu says, Ebirahana, let me please cross over. Says the Paneach Raza, one of the masters of the secrets of the Psukim. Paneach Raza says the Yarden was 50 amos wide. Moshe Rabbeinu said, Ebirahana, let me enter the land even 51 amos and just step 1 amma into Eretz Yisrael. What gives Kedusha to the dirt of Eretz Yisrael? Says Rabbi Yehuda Halevi on the 4th line. Afki be'amdi alei kivrois avoisai. Even as I stand by the graves of my patriarchs, ve'eshtoimim alei chevron, and I behold in wonderment, mivchar k'vayroyach, the choicest burial spots in Chevron, har ha'avarim, har ha'har, asher sham shnei oirim gedolim ma'irayach u'ma'irayach. Mount Avarim, Mount Har, the resting place of your 2 great lights. Moshe Rabbeinu, Aaron HaKohen. You know what gives Eretz Yisrael its Kedusha? The tzaddikim that are buried there. The fact that Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, Moshe, and Aaron are buried in Eretz Yisrael endows the dirt of Eretz Yisrael with Kedusha. By the way, we find the same principle in Sefer Nehemiah. Rav Soloveitchik points out that when Eretz Yisrael and Yerushalayim lay desolate, Nehemiah came before the king of Paras, and he said, he looked despondent, dejected. So the king said, Nehemiah, that's not honorable for you to look despondent and dejected in my presence. And Nehemiah said, Madua lo yareu panai. How can I not be dejected? Asher ha'ir beis kivrois avoisai chareva. When the city Yerushalayim, not the resting place of the Shechina, the place where my forefathers are buried, lay desolate. Which forefathers are buried in Yerushalayim? Moshe Rabbeinu is not buried there. Aaron's not buried there. The Avos are in Chevron. Who's buried in Yerushalayim? In Yerushalayim you have Har HaZeisim, you have Zechariah, you have Nevi'im, you have Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi, you have many early Nevi'im buried there. And then Rabbi Yehuda Halevi pens perhaps his most stirring words. Chaye neshamois avir artseich. A breath of life for the soul is the air of your land. Breathing the air of Eretz Yisrael invigorates the soul with life-giving properties to live a spiritual existence. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi expands on this idea in the Kuzari. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi says in the Kuzari that just like the body requires oxygen, the soul requires fine, delicate spiritual air. When one is in Israel and they breathe in the air, it's spiritually potent. In fact, the great Mekubal, the great grandfather of the Chidah, Rabbi Avram Azulai, says Eretz Yisrael is called Avira De'ara. Avira is oisios Avir HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Avir is a reference to Avir, the Avir of Hashem. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's greatest contribution to Torah literature is his great work, Kuzari. Kuzari describes the quest of the king of the Khazar tribe to determine the true religion by questioning a Christian, a Muslim, and a Jewish scholar. The king was finally convinced of the authenticity of Judaism, but he said he was able to point out one authentic flaw in Jewish observance, and that is, he says, the Jewish people pray 3 times a day. Hamachazir shchinasoi l'tzion. Said the king of the Khuzars, Aval ein divarenu ela kitziftzuf hazarzir. Our praying to go back to Eretz Yisrael is like the chirping of a bird. She'ein anachnu choshvim ma shenemar. Yeah, people will buy psicha for tal, psicha for geshem, for big bucks, because people want money to buy food, to indulge in New York. But when people pray to go back to Tzion, it's like they're reciting the telephone book in a foreign language. Ve'im, says the Kuzari, you know why Mashiach has not come? Because we tell God, we don't want Mashiach. No thank you. No thanks. But says the Kuzari, Im hayinu mizamnim atzmeinu likras alekei aveiseinu b'leivav sholem u'v'nefesh chafetza. If we would prepare ourselves to return to Hashem wholeheartedly in Eretz Yisrael, hayinu poigim ma shapagu aveiseinu b'Mitzrayim. But we have formally asked Hashem, please Hashem, do us a big favor. Do not bring the Mashiach. But if we would ask Him and we would go to Eretz Yisrael, then Mashiach would come. And the Kuzari took his own words to heart. And he set out to the land that his heart yearned for, and upon reaching Damascus, legend has it that he recited this Kinnah. And the Kloisenberger Rebbe himself, who before the war had a very different attitude toward Eretz Yisrael, after the war accepted upon himself to return to Eretz Yisrael, and on the plane, it is this Kinnah that the Kloisenberger Rebbe recited in his return to the Holy Land. Kinnah Lamed Vav Tzion Haloisa Shali. Okay, if I may just share with you 2 important thoughts on Kinnah Lamed Ches, and then we're going to discuss Kinnah Mem Aleph, which will be the final Kinnah that we will explicate. In Kinnah Lamed Ches that we just said, there's a very beautiful line that should be focused on. The 7th line, Shoichnei kevarim mechakim u'metzapim liyom yishech. Those who reside in their graves yearn for the day of your salvation. Va'oz yitzmechu, then they will flourish. Yichyu yeshenayach, and come to life. Which seems to indicate that there is an idea that there is tchias hamesim for those who await the geula. The Gemara Masechta Taanis says on Lamed Amud Beis, Kol hamisabel al Yerushalayim zoicha v'roya b'Yeshuasa. What does that mean? There have been many tzaddikim throughout the ages who have mourned for Yerushalayim and they never saw the building of Yerushalayim. Says the Ritva, Rabbeinu Yom Tov Bar Avram Al-Ashvili, we know in the end of days there will be a Tchias HaMesim, when man will reap his ultimate reward. But says the Ritva, from this Gemara of Kol HaMesav Yerushalayim, we learn there are two Tchias HaMesims. One for general tzaddikim in the end of days, but one will be for the tzaddikim who awaited, who yearned for the Geula. They will have VIP Tchias HaMesim, a resurrection, a revivification that will be only for the special tzaddikim who awaited the coming of the Beis HaMikdash, so that they can see B'necham Asiyan v'Yushalayim. That's what it means. Kol HaMesa'abel al Yushalayim zoiche v'roi b'shuasa. So says Rav Shlomo Brevda in his Sefer Yibana HaMikdash, this Ritva is alluded to in the 7th line. Shoichnei kevarim mechakim u'metzapim liyam yishech v'az yitzmechu yishu yishei noyach. Please take a look at page 342. We say, 4th line, Kida v'kaneh v'chal rashi b'samim. The scent of the Kida and the kaneh and other choice fragrances wafted adei ad ir tamarim to the city of palms, to Yerichai, b'vayreach simanoyach, where the fragrance of your spices reached. Af halavim asher shoymrim sha'arim. The gates, the sound of the Levites who open the gates, you know that creak? You know, if you have big gates without W2, what is it called? Just checking. WD-40, the gates make a very loud noise. The sound of the creaking gate could be heard in Yerichai. This is all documented in the Mishnah Masechta Tamid, where the Mishnah lists 10 activities that took place in Yerushalayim that could be heard, smelled, or sensed in Yerichai. Not only could the ketores be smelled, when the shofar was blown, it was heard in Yerichai. V'yeshomer af koilo shel kohen gadol b'shashu masker Hashem b'yom HaKippurim. What's the meaning of this? Comes the Ravid. By the way, regards from the Ravid. We just visited him in Provence. The Ravid, in his commentary to the Mishnah, says it wasn't that these phenomena were sensed in every equidistant around Yerushalayim to Yerichai. It was only in Yerichai, says the Ravid. Could you smell the ketores? Could you hear the shofar? Could you hear the creaking door? Says the Ravid, why? It was Maisa Nisim. Why did Hashem make the miracle? Says the Ravid, Sheyerichai haisa kama Yerushalayim. Jericho is like Jerusalem. Why is Yerichai like Yerushalayim? Since it's the first city Yeshua conquered, it's like the Truma of Eretz Yisrael, and it has been separated to have Kedusha like Yerushalayim. And that is why every miracle that took place in Yerushalayim was sensed in Yerichai. Says Shalos Tshuva Zichron Yosef, if you look in the Sifri, it says that when they were distributing Eretz Yisrael, they made a deal that any shevet that allows the Beis HaMikdash to be built in their shevet, they will get a compensation 500 amos by 500 amos b'doishnoi shel Yerichai. How is Yerichai compensation for Yerushalayim? Says the Zichron Yosef, according to the Ravid, that Yerichai is like Yerushalayim. We understand how Yerichai could take the place of Yerushalayim. Comes the Tzitz Eliezer, and Shalos Tzitz Eliezer Chelek Yud. We know Chelek Yud of Tzitz Eliezer is dedicated to the new halachos that came up now that Klal Yisrael got back all the Mekamis HaKadoshim in 1967. Chelek Yud, Tzitz Eliezer, of all the new halachos that were developed. Says that Tzitz Eliezer, it's absolutely haunting that during the 6-day war, at the precise same second that Jerusalem was freed, Yerichai was also conquered. And therefore, says the Tzitz Eliezer, something that nobody ever paid attention to, that just like Yerushalayim is Yifei Noif Mesois Kol Haaretz, and we would never give up Yerushalayim, likewise, you can never give up the city of Yerichai. Kinnus Mem Aleph. Now, when I was preparing the Kinnus this year, my gut reaction was, I'm going to start, the intro is going to be about Kinnus Mem Aleph. After all, only a few days ago, about 10 days ago, we stood opposite Hotel de Ville in the square in Paris, where the 24 cartloads of Shas and their commentaries were burnt in the year 1242. The author of this Kinnus was Rabbi Meir Bar Baruch, the Marami Rutenberg, one of the last of the Balei HaTosfos. In fact, he's the author of Tosfos HaMasechta Yuma. You look in Tosfos HaMasechta Yuma, the Chida points out the signon, the lashon, the expression is different. It was composed, it was redacted by the Marami Rutenberg, who's a student of the Ar Zarua. And Marami Rutenberg was imprisoned in a castle in Einsesheim, and an exorbitant sum was requested for his release, and he paskin they weren't allowed to release him because Ein Poidinas Hashem Yasser Mikdei Demeim. And his student, the Rosh, disagreed. He says this doesn't apply to the Gadol Hadar, and the Rosh personally took upon himself to raise a requisite sum. But by the time the Rosh came up with the sum, the Marami Rutenberg had already died in 1327, and then the Rosh figured they're after him, so the Rosh had to run away to Spain. It's interesting, when the Maram died in Spain, in prison, they would not release his remains. And a wealthy man by the name of Alexander Wimpfen paid for the release of his remains on condition that when Alexander would pass away, he would be allowed to be buried right next to the Maram. And sure enough, you could go to Worms and you could see the burial spot of the Maram, and right next to that is Alexander Wimpfen. Now, this Kinnus mourns the burning of 24 wagon loads of Shas in Paris. The king of France at the time was Louis IX, known as Saint Louis, not for his tzidkus and piety, but rather his religious zeal to oppress the Jewish people, especially the favor that he showed to Jewish apostates. Nicholas Donin was a Jewish apostate. Now I want to tell you something very interesting that I just saw over the last couple of days, written by Martin Gilbert in the book Churchill and the Jews. We mentioned this quote earlier. This is literally one of the most powerful things I ever read. Churchill observed something that the Gemara tells us, that when the Jewish people rise up, they rise up all the way to the stars, and when they fall to the abyss. You know who the most brutal movement in the history of the world was? The Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks eradicated Judaism in Russia in 10 years, what 200 years of Russian czars could not do. And the Bolsheviks were all Jews. They were all Jews. The only one who wasn't a Jew is, they said, Lenin, because they didn't know Lenin's grandfather was a Jew. They said Lenin, the Bolsheviks are not Jews because they're led by Lenin, and Lenin's not a Jew. Lenin was, his Zayda was a Jew. They were all Jews. And they eradicated Judaism, the Soviet Union, in the course of 10 years. And Churchill was torn what to do, because he had a certain sympathy for the Jews. So Churchill wrote, the Jews, some people like them, some people don't, but everyone agrees they are the most formidable people in the history of mankind. And as we mentioned earlier, the battle that beats within everyone's chest between good and evil is magnified manyfold in the heart of the Jew. And Churchill wrote about how all the values of Christianity were brought to the world through the Jewish people, and how the greatest threat to Christianity are also the Jews through the Bolsheviks. And Churchill had to make a personal decision whether to rally his people to try to advocate on behalf of the Jews, knowing that his best friends were killed by the Bolsheviks. But Churchill put into such clear terms the evil that a Jew is capable of, and of course the great good that a Jew is capable of. But throughout history, meharsayich umachrivayich mimeyayich yitzeu, the greatest enemies of the Jews are the Jews. The main inquisitors in Spain were Jews. Torquemada was of Jewish descent. Of course, it can't be any other way. The greatest threat to Judaism, of course, are the Reform and Conservative. The Jews are their worst enemy. And in 1242, Nicholas Danin, a Jewish apostate, was especially vicious to his former co-religionists. He forcibly caused the baptism of the Jews of Anjou and Poitiers, 500 Jews under the threat of death. 3,000 in all were murdered al Kiddush Hashem. Nicholas Danin realized the backbone and the foundation of Judaism was Talmud Bavli. The backbone of Judaism was Talmud Bavli, and therefore he formally made an accusation to Pope Gregory IX that the Talmud contained passages that were heretical to Christianity, and the Pope ordered all copies of the Talmud to be confiscated March 3rd, 1240. The Jews were in Shul, they came into the Shul, they gathered all the Gemaras. And a public debate was held in Paris between Nicholas Danin and four of the most eminent Rabbanim in Paris, Rabbi Yechiel of Paris, who ultimately went to Akko with 300 Balei Atosis where he died. It would have been burnt immediately if not for the advocacy of the Bishop of Sens, who then convulsed in front of the king, and then the burning of the Talmud was a foregone conclusion. Here's the question. This is the question of the year, and if you could remember one thing from the Kinnus of Tavshin Pei Beis, it's this approach, because we've mentioned it many, many times today. Why do we mourn the tragedy of the burning of the Talmud on Tisha B'Av? Sounds like a familiar question. We've never asked this question before. What is it? Because it's always at the end of Kinnus, and it's almost by Chatzos. And most by now, it's Ashreichem Yisrael that you stayed until now. Why do we mourn the tragedy of the burning of the Shas on Tisha B'Av? It didn't happen on Tisha B'Av. It was perpetrated not by the Roman government, it was perpetrated by a Jew. What does this have to do with Churban Beis HaMikdash? What would Rav Moshe? Would Rav Moshe say this is also an offshoot of Churban Beis HaMikdash? But based on the approach that we're offering this year, none of the Kinnus are because we're mourning Jewish tragedy. The purpose of the Kinnah is to identify the causes of Churban that reverberate ad Hayom. And the same way we mourn the Asara Harugei Malchus, because we're commemorating that the Sinas Chinam displayed to Yosef, Adayin Meraki Banu, is still prevalent. And the same way we mourn the Crusades, not because they're related to the Churban, but because the Aveira of apathy toward Eretz Yisrael is still prevalent today. The same could be applied to the burning of the Shas, because one of the eyewitnesses to the burning of the Shas was Rabbi Hillel of Verona, who observed the fact that shortly before the Shas was burnt, they burnt the works of the Rambam. There was a big machlokes with the teachings of the Rambam. Many of the sages of Provence defended the Rambam. Rav Shlomo ben Ahar, Rabbeinu Yoina were against the ideas of the Rambam in the Sefer Hamada and the Mar Nevuchim. And ultimately the works of the Rambam were submitted to the monks of the Dominican order. And of course they found the works of the Rambam to be antithetical to Christianity, and the works of the Rambam were burnt. And Rabbi Hillel of Verona said, how do I know the reason why the Shas was burnt was because heaven took up the cause of the honor of the Rambam? Because in the very same spot that they burnt the Shas, the ashes of the Rambam mixed with those ashes. And why do we read about this on Tisha B'Av? Because we know why we got into this mess in the first place. Sinas Chinam, which is the most misunderstood and abused concept in Judaism. Sinas Chinam. You know, why can't this group get along with that group? Why can't this yarmulke get along with that yarmulke? Says Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz, Sinas Chinam means people hate Rabbanim. That's what Sinas Chinam means. Yeah, I love my friend sitting next to me in shul, but I hate the rabbi, the rav, the Rosh Hashiva. That's Sinas Chinam. That's how Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz understands the story of Kamsa Bar Chamsa. And this is the grand finale of the Kinnus. They had Sinas Chinam to who? To Rabbeinu Moshe ben Maimon. The Ritva says, Mi Moshe v'yad Moshe lo'ikam. There was nobody since Moshe Rabbeinu like the Rambam. But the Jewish people didn't like the Rambam. His ideas were too broad for them. They didn't fit the very narrow passageway that they carved out. That anyone who steps a little bit to the right is michutz lamachane, and anyone who steps a little to the left is a heretic apikairas. And recently at the Aguda convention, they say, you know why there's so many young teenagers who go off the derech? Because the derech has become so narrow, it's become like a tightrope. There's nowhere for anyone to walk anymore. And it's the same thing with the Chachmei Yisrael. Why don't people accept the Chachmei Yisrael? Because in their minds they've created such a narrow passageway of what's legitimately accepted to their minds that anyone who steps to the right or to the left is not part of their machane. The problem is there's no one in their machane. Their machane is empty. The only thing that fills their machane is a raging fire of sinas chinam to the Gedolei Yisrael. And that's where Kinnus Mem Aleph comes in. We're not burning the loss of books. We're not mourning the loss of manuscripts. We're again identifying, as we close the Kinnus, the root cause of how we got in this mess, and that is the sinas chinam. And the same way we mourn the Asara Haruge Malchus, mentioning how the sinas chinam that was to Yosef, Adayin Merach Geit Banu, and is still prevalent. Well, we conclude in the same way. Kinnus Mem Aleph, Shali Srufa Va'esh L'Shleim Avelayach.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.